In any case, we left it at identification with the aggressor. Just before that, we have talked a little bit about what identification is and the difference between the identification and imitation. Now, identification with the aggressor is a special form of identification, what people do, and it happens both to children and adults, children, adolescents, and adults. Very common in children in more primitive forms, as you will see in a moment, and very common in adults as well, sometimes in very dramatic situations. For example, what this means is that whoever is perceived as an aggressor or a danger to you, somebody who hurts you or has the potential to hurt or damage you, you identify with him and you become like him. It's partly in the principle, if you can beat them, join them. Okay? Now children do that, for example, if they go to, I don't know, to the dentist and they have some dental work done, they may go home and then get the little sister and play dentist to them, try to pull the teeth or the cat or whoever it may be, you know. It's an identification with the aggressor. It's reasonably benign. It's you know, an attempt at mastering the anxiety through that kind of activity. And that one is not too bad. It's a way of dealing with anxiety, which is what defenses are for, to keep the ego in balance. Adults, for example, perhaps the most dramatic example is in concentration camps, when some Jews, in fact, identified with the Nazis and participated in the atrocities of the Nazis. That was not a common phenomenon, but it did happen. And it's an extreme case of it. Some children in schools, and we see this as a common phenomenon nowadays, we always have bullies in school, somebody who is more aggressive and is abusive and is a little sadistic and probably has learned that from things that he may be experiencing at home or seeing at home, whatever it may be. And then, of course, many of the children become very frightened and concerned about these bullies, and what some of them do is to join the bully. They become bullies. They become part of the bully crowd. Identification with the aggressor is a way of dealing with fear and anxiety and danger and things of that kind, yeah? Now there is regression. Regression is a common defense. We have been talking in the past about fixation and regression and all that. Remember when we were talking about the libidinal phases of development, how you can move through the phases, and then if the difficulties at the higher levels are too much or too strong, you regress back where you left your fixation points. It's a common phenomenon. It's typical for the neurosis. It's very easy to identify and these things apply to all ages. If it is a child, the mother may tell you, well, you know, he sucked his thumb until he was 2.5 and then he stopped. Never did that. He was a big boy. He saw the kids putting his finger in his mouth. He said, you're a baby or something. But when he was 5 and all of this happened, or the father left the house, or he had surgery, whatever it may be, he has gone back to sucking his thumb. And he's not any longer ashamed of doing it in front of anybody. See, that's a regression to a previous stage of development where sucking your thumb was a desirable activity. You know, comforting, a comfort type of activity. Adults do the same. And this is a typical mechanism of neurosis, typically when the situation that leads to the explosion of symptoms, you know, the conflicts, the balance between the forces in conflict becomes such that the only solution is the production of symptom formation. If the patient cannot keep themselves at the high level, they may go back to wherever the most important fixations are. And then they will manifest in behavior, in fantasies, and in ego interest, the phenomena that is typical for that phase. For example, somebody may become a collector of stamps or whatever, you know. If he has an inner fixation, that's one way of showing it. He may be very interested in this sort of thing. Or somebody may start to overeat, or to smoke, or to do a variety of different things with the mouth, which just points to the fact that they have made a significant move back to the oral stage of development and are now orally regress. And with that goes a lot of other ego phenomena. You know, when people goes that far back, you know, their ego gets somewhat affected by the regression, and so they become a little more hopeless and more clinging and more demanding, and feel less capable of coping with the world and need help, and get very rattled if nobody is there to see what their needs are and why they don't help me and why they ask me to do these things. And, you know, they become regress to that level, and that level people feel kind of hopeless and a little helpless. Very common. Some adults, for example, adults that become obsessional as adults, suddenly start to develop obsessional ruminations and symptoms and so on, will show a lot of signs of activity of the anal stage of development. That's the point to which they regress, because remember, one regresses to wherever the main fixation point has been established in the way forward. And so these people may start to develop interests that they never had before, which are related to that stage of development. Or the aspects may change. They may have been very clean people, reasonable people, now they are dirty. They develop interest in activities that they wouldn't have thought of before, that are somewhat anal oriented and things of that kind. That obviously include sexual activities of certain types as well. Now, there are a number of forms of withdrawal, particularly 3 of them. These are ones that one tends to pay more attention to. One of them is withdrawal into fantasy. And that's a very common mechanism. Everybody uses it. It's a very common resource that human being uses without necessity being by using this mechanism, particularly neurotic or anything of the sort. In fact, it's a very useful way to restore the balance temporarily. You know, you are in pain, you develop a fantasy where you feel relief. And you remember what we said about the fantasies. It's a world, a way of thinking, in which you suspend reality testing, but you are not crazy, like people that suspend reality testing. When you suspend reality testing, you usually become psychotic, because you don't distinguish inside from outside, what is your own thoughts with what is really happening out there. You confuse them, and then that means you are not reality testing, you are psychotic. In the world of fantasy, though you suspend reality testing, you know that the fantasy isn't real. In other words, you don't lose the contact with reality. You just decide to suspend the criteria that usually you use in reality to deal with things, and behave as if these rules did not exist. All right? So in your fantasy, instead of you, I don't know, being in debt because you pay more money than you should do with your credit cards, now you have a big balance in the bank and you're going to pay all your accounts and all of that. It's a withdrawal into fantasy. Common, very common, used in any number of painful circumstances. And children do this a lot. They will draw into any number of fantasies. And when that happens, usually the full performance deteriorates because they can't pay attention. They are no longer paying attention to the teacher. They are now withdrawn into a world of fantasies. And teachers frequently will tell the parents, he's not here. He's in a world of his own. You can see that he's somewhere else. We don't know what he's thinking, but he's certainly not here. Common in children, as I said, common in adults, frequently in children when there are difficulties at home and conflicts between the parents and things of that kind. And then the children, of course, have all kinds of fantasies about what is going to happen, who's going to leave, who's going to hurt whom, all kinds of things. And so they are lost in this play, of fantasies. And in that case, obviously they are not creating compensatory fantasies where things are made good. From something bad becomes something good. Some of the fantasies are like trying to guess what is going to happen, given the limited amount of information that they have as to the consequences of parents fighting and threatening one another or being violent, verbally or physically, to one another and so on. There is withdrawal into the self, and that means that people no longer is interested in the object world. So they withdraw from the friends, they withdraw from the usual activities. If they went to bars and drink, or went to a bar or somewhere to hear music, or to restaurants to eat and so on, they abandon all of that activities and are withdrawn into the self. They are by themselves, they don't want to see anybody, or they avoid contact with other people. And that obviously is a massive type of defense that limits the ego tremendously and kind of builds a wall between you and the object world. Yeah? Now, why that happens, any number of reasons will lead to withdrawal into the self. Not uncommonly, disappointment with objects will lead to that. Withdrawal into passivity is a different and the last form of withdrawal that we really concern ourselves with. And what that means is that people abandon activity. In other words, anything that needs to be done to get where you want to go, you don't do anymore. You become passive. So if there is a new job being offered that you have been eyeing for years in the place of work and so on, and it does require that you go and fill an application and talk to 2 or 3 people and so on, you don't do any of that. And consider that withdrawal into passivity. You stop all activity that will lead you there, you become passive, and of course it's very maladaptive. It means you're not going to get anywhere where you perhaps legitimate should have gone to. Now, passivity is like a character. It's across the board. Withdrawal into passivity means that somebody was not passive before, but has now suddenly become passive. So before he could be active when he needed to be active. And then now he has withdrawn into a passive attitude. Passivity is a pervasive general attitude where people are simply passive, like the person that is withdrawing to that passive state at that stage, only that is universal and across the board. It becomes like a character trait. So that's, it's obviously a very maladaptive defense that will limit your ability to deal with the world effectively and to be successful, because you're required to exercise a certain amount of active, go get it, go and compete, go and be aggressive behavior, and whoever has this as defense has abandoned all of these behaviors, so he doesn't do anything that requires activity. Now, and this is number 21 for those of you that have the list. It's one called turning passive into active. And that is, some people feels a lot better and less anxious if they do it themselves than if it is done to them. Let me give you examples. Some people will rather give themselves shots than have somebody give them shots. They feel more comfortable that way. So, no, tell me how to do it, I do it myself. That's a form of this type of defense, of turning passive into active. In other words, something that is going to happen to you, that you will have to suffer passively or submit yourself passively to it, you want to take an active role and do it yourself. Now, extreme cases of it are people who are told you have 3 months to live. That's all you have. There's no way out of it. You have whatever it may be, a malignant form of cancer, survival, possibilities about 3-6 months, whatever it is. And these people don't wait for death to come. They will actively seek death. And they feel a lot better that way. So that's an extreme case. With the in-between these two extremes, there are all kinds of variations of this defense. Is very commonly used, and sometimes it's useful. Sometimes it's actually an adaptive defense in certain situations. Now there are this defense, which is here in the list number 22. This one is called rationalization. And what that means is that you're trying to explain to or justify to yourself or to somebody else something that really doesn't make any sense, and in the light of logic and reason would not stand that test. People will say, but what are you saying? That doesn't make sense. But people will use any number of arguments to try and convince you, I don't know, I always use some ridiculous examples. For example, you want, I don't know.
Flat Earth Society. The Flat Earth Society in London. They believe that it's an optical illusion.
Yeah. Well, let's say that you want to buy a car that is very expensive and a little bit out of your really budget, and your wife said, but why do you want to buy that car? It's incredibly expensive, and we really have, the mortgage and the children's college, whatever. And he said, well, yeah, but think about it. This car, it is true, it consumes a lot of gas because it has a very powerful engine. But look, the rates says that it breaks very rarely, so we are probably going to save a lot of money from not going to, you know what I mean? You start to build a web of what I call rationalizations, which mean an attempt to explain something that doesn't really stand the test of logic and can be seen in the light of reason and be agreeable. But we sell this to ourselves and to a lot of other people. Rationalization is an extraordinarily common use defense, and it's at times quite irritating, particularly if you are close to somebody who uses of preference rationalization. They make your life pretty miserable because they're selling you the Brooklyn Bridge, and it is not for sale. And it's a constant event, they're always trying to explain the inexplicable on the light of reason, and usually that has consequences for the family, for the children, for the work, for whatever it may be, yeah? So that's rationalization. Certain age groups use this defense as a preferred mechanism. Adolescents. Adolescents rationalize anything. And sometimes it's incredibly ridiculous. You say, what? But they tell you with straight face, they've been trying to make it sound real good, and you say it doesn't make any sense, but adolescents do that. They use a lot of rationalization. Intellectualization is different. Rationalization, usually, you can see through it. You say, it doesn't make sense. It only makes sense to you. It doesn't make sense to anybody else. Intellectualization is different. Here people use their intellect and their knowledge to try and explain situations. And they go into the most complicated kind of exercises in their mind in terms of trying to explain why this happened, or why they did this, or why they didn't do that, and so on. It's intellectualization. It's usually, as you will imagine, a favorite defense of highly intelligent people, because they can play with arguments. Lawyers are very good at this. Yeah, I'm sure that in the test of lawyers, this kind of a skill is one of the ones that they look for, because it's an argument, which is a logical, sound argument, may not quite fit to the facts, but yet is not completely isolated from the facts. And obsessionals, which usually are highly intelligent, use an enormous amount of intellectualization, because they like to deal with ideas. And so they play with ideas. It's like a kind of mental masturbation. They don't like affects. So they avoid anything that has an emotional charge with their ideas. That's wonderful. So that's a defense. As I said, all of these defenses of preference tend to be used by certain type of psychopathology, in certain cases of psychopathology. Mm-hmm. And in certain types of ego that are more ignored. For example, as I told you, intellectualization requires obviously a certain level of intelligence and knowledge and verbal skills, so that you can, play in your own mind with these things, because you are not necessarily doing this for anybody else. That may be the case. You frequently are doing this to yourself. You are convincing yourself through these argumentations or something that you did, probably shouldn't have done, or feeling guilty about, or whatever. And you're trying to coat the pill with sugar, kind of. Now, there are a number of defenses which, and this group here is really typical of obsessionals, as you will see in a moment, that relate to isolation. And there are two main types of isolation. One is isolation of content, and the other one is isolation of affect. Isolation of content is like if you have a number of shoe boxes where you put information, what it is in the shoebox. This shoebox, it can communicate with the next shoebox because they are walls, and yet they are related. But you isolate one from one another, and so people doesn't see the obvious relation. People isolate content in that particular way. Common defense, typically used by obsessionals all the time. They are great isolators of content, and I have given you examples of this in the past. You remember when we were talking about another defense, I gave you an example of somebody who is rude to the wife in the morning because the coffee didn't have enough sugar, and say, hey, I'll do coffee, and left in a hoof, and comes in the evening with a bunch of roses. And she says, put them, where I don't want your roses. And he's extraordinarily surprised, because he has isolated the incident in the morning from what she's doing now. She put it in the first shoebox, and so it's not in the second shoebox. Why is she reacting this way, he lost the connection, it's isolation of content. So things remain isolated. And as you know, obviously, if you use that defense extensively, and severe obsessionals do, you are very handicapped. Because your world is split into bits and pieces, and they don't necessarily connect with each other when you need to see the connection. And that obviously creates a lot of problems. Isolation of affect is that you take the affect that corresponds to a content and take it away. So that the person will tell you something got awful. My child got run over by a 12-wheeler last night, and his brain looked like this piece of paper. It was flat like that. Cool like a lettuce, no affect to it. He isolated the affect. If you don't isolate the affect, such a content will produce an emotional outburst. Yeah? But isolators of affect manage to talk about things in a way that they look cool like a lettuce. And indeed they are, because they have taken the affect somewhere else. Now that's the problem, because usually that affect gets attached to some place where it shouldn't be. And so somewhere else there is going to be an enormous reaction, which is not related to the stimuli that provokes that reaction, because that affect that was taken out of here was added over there. And so the explosion takes place over there, not here. You see what I mean? There is that kind of interaction. Very typical of obsessions. As I told you, obsessionals don't like dealing with affects. They like playing with ideas. Another defense of obsessionals is called doing and undoing. I gave you an example which contains both isolation of content and doing and undoing. When I told you of the fellow who in the morning blasts his wife because the coffee is not sweet enough, and then comes with the flour. What he's doing, he's trying to undo what he did in the morning. That's why it's called doing. He did something in the morning, he's trying to undoing it with some other behavior. So the buying of the flour is an attempt to undoing it. He gets lost as well because he has isolated the content. So he doesn't relate what happened in the morning with a rejection now. That's a different type of defense mechanism, but frequently they go together, yeah? Remember, many of these defense mechanisms will act in pairs or in trios, 2 or 3 of them get together to produce a certain result. Very common, doing and undoing. It happens all the time. It's very typical of obsessions. And the reason for that is that they have very severe superegos, and which is always questioning. What they do is very punitive, very archaic and primitive. And so they have to be appeasing it all the time. Practically anything that they do is wrong. And they get persecuted by a superego, and they are trying to appease it by doing with some other kinds of behavior. Very painful problem. Splitting. Splitting is a very malignant defense. Most of the time, except for, rare temporary forms of splitting that may take place sometimes and be not that bad, but most of splitting is very damaging, because essentially you have taken a part of yourself and put it somewhere else. In a way, it's like isolation of content. Part of your ego and another part of your ego is completely ignored. The difference is that in isolation of content, you then cannot relate what happened in the morning to what happened in the evening. Here you have split a whole bit of your ego. It's not an incident that you split the content. It's the whole of your ego. A big chunk of it is taken out there, and you don't know that it is there. Now, sometimes people are split into more than 2 pieces. Indeed, as you know, this is a phenomenon that is closely associated with dissociative phenomena. And there are some dissociation types that may have 3 or 4 different types of personalities. So splitting is a very malignant defense. It does a lot of damage. In the best cases of splitting, you have lost a significant chunk of yourself, which is not now available to you, and that's never good. And in the very malignant case, of course, it can do an incredible amount of damage. You are essentially psychotic, and indeed some forms of dissociation are kind of psychotic dissociation, where the behavior of the dissociated part may be criminal, and murderous, sadistic murderers and things like that. So that's splitting. Not good. Try not to do that if you can help it. As I told you, you can choose. These things do happen, yeah? Obviously, people that sit here are not very likely to be splitting, but you will see many patients that do this. Now, there are some forms of what is called reversal. There are reversal of affects and reversal of roles. Reversal of roles is very simple, and it's commonly done. It's very common in children and in late latency kids, a little less common in adults, but it does exist. And some of your patients will do that. They reverse roles. They come to you to talk about whatever their problems, difficulties, inhibitions, symptoms and so on, and suddenly they become your therapists. They are wondering, they are giving you interpretations about your behavior and things of that kind. That's a reversal of roles. Instead of being a patient, now he's a therapist and he's treating you as a patient. Yeah? Obviously, that is, generally speaking, a resistance to the treatment, and that's the purpose that it mostly fulfills. The patient is trying to avoid looking at himself, so he's looking at you. And is sometimes therapists, particularly if you are not familiar with the defense or don't have a lot of experience, you can get very irritated by this because you don't know what to do with it. And these patients usually are very perceptive, which means that what he may be remarking on is true. And you know it's true. None of his business, but it's true. And so it hits you somewhere. When in fact this is very good grease for the mill. Because you can show him usually what it is that he is hiding behind his behavior, or when it is that he has started to reverse a role, and it was when you started to talk about this, that, or the other, and then that became a little bit too much, and now you are interested in me, not any longer in yourself and what you were saying the other day. And so you can, control the situation. But it is common. Children do this a lot. They reverse roles. So a child that is having a bad time at school because the teacher is unhappy with him and punishing him or sending him to the corner or whatever, gets home and does that to the family, is a little like identification with the aggressor. Only that here is not the aggressive part of it that becomes a part of you and what you identify with. Here is the role of the person, which need not be aggressive, maybe even a loving role. And the child reverses roles. He becomes a teacher who is telling the cat, you don't behave, go to the corner, or puts the cat in the room or whatever it is, because he made a mess. Maybe he pees on his pants in the school or whatever it may be that is happening. So reversal of roles is very, very common, in children particularly. Reversal of affects is really a very kind of interesting defense. It's used by all kind of people. It's usually a very maladaptive defense, except in children. reversal of affects in children is nearly normal, at least during certain stages in development. In adults, it's not so normal. And that is what could it be, that somebody comes and gives you very bad news, at least you make you cry, you start to laugh, you know. And everybody says, what is he laughing about? There's nothing to laugh about. He should be very perturbed about this. It's a reversal of the feeling that will be intolerable, will be devastating, in fact will be traumatic, and that's why the role is, the affect is reversed, to avoid the damage to the ego paralysis that will ensue if this is taken literally, you know. Children do that a lot, and sometimes in most dramatic circumstances. For example, a child whose mother may have died, and he heard the news, the mother died. He may not even understand that too well, but it's obviously bad because everybody's crying and so on. He may go into the street laughing, my mother died, my mother, ha! And so everybody's, what? Is this child crazy? He's not crazy. It's a reversal of affect. And for him, that's normal. Children have no tolerance for intense affects. They can contain them. And they're very devastating. They don't know what to do with them. They don't have an ego to handle them or to dispose of them or to neutralize them or to put some here and so. It's devastating to them. And so what they do is they reverse it. And it sounds very uncanny. Because even the family said, doesn't he love his mother? I mean, what is he, crazy? His mother died. Why is he laughing? You know. That's very, 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 very common. And indeed it may be that evening, that everybody is mourning and very distressed and so on, he wants to see the cartoons and laugh like crazy, even the cartoons and so on, because he needs to do that, you know. It's a reversal of affect. Otherwise it'd be a devastating trauma for them. Yeah.
You have reversal of affects where people can't experience joy, like just negative. I'm thinking of somebody particularly. The other way around. They
Yeah, you could.
experience joy.
You could. Yeah, there are people, that's rare though. But there are people that cannot accept any good happening. That's frightening and dangerous. And it's like a forerunner of some tragedy that will follow because you don't deserve anything good. And so, these people, if you praise them or they get a good grade or whatever, they quickly dismiss that, they don't enjoy it. Indeed, sometimes they go to extremes. I'll give you an example. Van Gogh, the painter, Vincent, when he was a kid, he used to draw very well. He had a gift for that. And his mother used to draw. And he was the eldest. He was not really the eldest, there was another child born before him that died at birth or shortly thereafter, called Vincent van Gogh too, so he was the second Vincent van Gogh. But what? Because that one died, he was the eldest child. And of course he, like many children, did copy some of the activities of the parents, and sometimes they have inherited some of the skills, you know, the brain pathways that make drawing something that you can do easily. He did that very easily. But if anybody praised what he did, he will destroy it immediately. And people couldn't understand that. He will destroy it immediately. Now, later on, when he was an adult and a painter, you know, he had a lot of problems. But towards the end of his life, and as you know, he was never very successful during his lifetime. His success, in fact, he sold one painting in his lifetime, and that was to the sister of a painter friend of him, and obviously did it as an act of charity. But as soon as he died, or very quickly thereafter, his paintings skyrocketed. You know, a good Van Gogh is worth $50 million. That's a lot of money. In any case, Later on, as I said, toward the end of his life, there was an exhibition in Paris where, and this was shortly before he committed suicide, may have had something to do even with his suicide. There was an exhibition in Paris, and the critics praised him to the heavens. First time in his life, he became incredibly disturbed and wrote letters to all the critics saying, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't praise me, praise Gauguin. He is a real painter, I'm nothing, don't praise me. You know. He didn't destroy his paintings, but that was his attitude. He couldn't receive any kind of... yeah, he's an interesting character for analysts because you can learn a lot about him. You know. Okay, let's see, that's reversible affect. But that part, that second way of doing it is very rare. Happens, but it's rare. But there are a group of patients that fear anything good happening to them as danger, because somewhere they have obviously an enormous unconscious sense of guilt, and if anything good happens, that means that a catastrophe has to follow very closely, because this is people again, we are back in people that have very archaic and primitive superegos, they get persecuted by the superego. So it happens to a certain type of people or in a certain specific set of circumstances. All of these defenses, incidentally, are very good in that sense. If you are really familiar with the defenses, you usually can draw an inference as to what it is that is being defended and why, and from what time it came, and things of that kind. And that, of course, throws a lot of information in the patient that it's like suddenly opening a window and seeing a landscape that you have never seen before, you know. It's very telling and meaningful. These other defenses are a little more difficult to, some of them, to define, but they are definable. And remember what I told you, each one of these defenses is unique, is a unique entity, is distinct from all other defenses. It's defined differently. It's a character on its own right. It's a personality different from other defense personalities. Okay. Now there is one that is called anticipation by provocation. Common, and it's done by everybody. Perhaps very common. It's easier seen in children, because they may have done something bad that the parents don't know anything about it, but when the parents get home, he's raising holy hell until he gets a spank, and then he's satisfied. That's called anticipation by provocation. It's feeling so guilty, and superego is really telling him you need to be punished, so that he does something that will irritate the parents enough and he gets punished. That's anticipation by provocation. Very visible in children, it's obvious. You have children, you would have seen that more than once. And it leads you to think, well, what is it that he's being in need of punishment for, you know? That's the next question. Why does he need this? What did he do? Or what did you do? In any case, adults do that too. They do the same. What they do is they provoke somebody. The boyfriend, the husband, whatever it is, and there is a big problem and a big fight, and maybe a falling out, and you know, a bad, unpleasant situation. And that's anticipation by provocation. People are feeling very guilty, and they procure something to appease their superegos they have learned.
I was wondering if you could do that within the self, if you could provoke yourself.
Yeah, you can. You can.
And that's still the same defense?
Yes, sure you can. That's more complex though. This is usually done with objects in the outside the self. But yeah, that's possible. But there are other ways, perhaps of describing that, which are more fitting. that anticipation by provocation in terms of the self. But conceivably it could be done. I never thought of it, but yeah, I think it could be done.
Like with a masochistic.
Huh?
Like with a masochistic type of person who
Yeah.
might do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now there is one called somatization. This is people that transform things into hypochondriacal preoccupations or symptoms and things of that kind, and use that as a defense. It's common. It's gross. It's kind of hysterical type of defense. And it's, I don't know, the wife say, oh, I have such a terrible headache. Don't even mention it tonight. I mean, something like that, you know. The husband who said, oh, I have such a day, I mean, I couldn't possibly think of this today, forget it, you know. Maybe tomorrow or whatever. It's the use of somatic complaints to avoid certain things, you know. Now, there is something called overcompensation. As you know, there is, analysts think of a complex of inferiority. And that's common. We all have some of that somewhere. We all grow that rose in the back garden, but it depends, as I always tell you, how many you grow and how big these bushes grow in your back garden. But we all do something like that. We don't talk of a complex of superiority. That's not a concept that Freud thought was a valid concept. But what people that is using this definition for this type of defense is that they overcompensate for the feelings of inferiority by aggrandizing the self. It doesn't really mean that they feel they are this grand, this big. The feeling of inferiority is still there. So it's always the primitive phenomena is the feeling of inferiority. What people do in order to cover it, which may be overcompensating by grandiose fantasies, is just an attempt to cover up the hole, but it never does, you know. And that's why they keep doing it. If you didn't have the feeling of inferiority, you wouldn't need the overcompensation. You would stop it, you know. But it's a never-ending phenomenon, yeah. So, making reparations. That sounds like undoing, but it isn't, because undoing is related to an event, something that you did that you have to undo. It's a specific event, specific action, specific incident, wherever it took place. Making reparations is a general trait, more universal. Is people that constantly have to do things in order to make reparations for a sense of guilt that they don't understand, but it forces them to constantly be making reparations. It's not related to any specific incident. It's not trying to undo anything specifically. It's more like a character trait, you know. And there is another form of defense very commonly used. It's called turning aggression against the self. In other words, there are people that when they feel violent or angry or get provoked and want to lash out at somebody or hurt somebody or attack somebody or whatever, you know, destroy somebody, kill them, whatever their fantasy is. They don't do that. What they do is they turn aggression against the self. And these people are accident prone. You have to be very careful with them, particularly if they are children. You remember today in the seminar we were talking about children early on having fantasies of jumping out of the window because they want to do like Peter Pan. And I was telling the candidates here a story of a patient that I had many years ago who had a little girl who had seen Peter Pan play and wanted to fly out the window. And she was very concerned because they live in a house that had a very extensive second floor. And so what she did is she took a the little girl to the second floor and with a couple of eggs. She liked eggs because she had little chicks coming out of the eggs and, kept them and so on. So she liked eggs. She showed them the eggs and said, see the eggs, you like them? He said, yeah, well, they have chicks. She said, no, these are eggs like the one that you eat. But let me show you what happens if they fly out of the window. So she dropped them and took the little girl down the stairs. And when she got down, I said, where are the eggs? And the mother said, there, that's the egg. But it doesn't any longer look like an egg. It's not recognizable anymore. It got destroyed, it got damaged. And see, you fly out of the window, that's what will happen to you. You will look like an egg. And of course, you didn't want to fly out of the window ever again, which I thought was very clever. It was a way of dealing with the problem. In a way that she could understand. This was a 4.5 years old child. And, but I mentioned this because people that turn aggression against the self tend to have a lot of accents, particularly children, You have children, and you will see this in psychotherapy, that become aggressive and want to hurt you or somehow become aggressive in the session. They may start to do things that are dangerous, like wanting to climb on top of the desk and jump, or, pull on the bookshelf, open the window, hit the window, God knows what. But you have to become very careful because they have a tendency to hurt themselves. And that obviously is something that you need to avoid as much as you can. Now, adults do that too. In adults, it's a very malignant defense, so it is in children, because it could hurt them very badly. Particularly in children, because they don't remember. The younger they are, the less they are able to draw cause and effect inferences, like this little girl. And that's why I thought that throwing the eggs down was such a good example, because that she could understand. Otherwise, you couldn't explain that to her verbally, because the capacity for abstraction at that age is not there to be able to put this together as a whole concept, you know what I mean? Well, adults do that, and they tend to turn aggression against the self, and usually that's very malignant. A lot of masochistic people does that. What they do is they turn aggression against the self. In other words, what they do is they get their sadism, which was directed towards the object, and that's called primary sadism, yeah? And he's turned against the self, and it becomes primary masochism. Yeah? And it's a very common type of defense. It's obviously very maladaptive, creates a lot of problems, and there are many forms of this. The turning of aggression against the self doesn't always mean that violence is done to the self in the sense of hurting the self. There is moral masochism, which is another form of turning aggression against the self, some people that feel that they need to be punished think very bad about themselves and make it a whip and whip themselves like in the Middle Ages to atone for the sins. Other people thought about it, how bad they were, and felt very ashamed and so on, but left it at that point. Didn't have to whip themselves or go to extreme measures. And so there are all of these differences. That particular defense, as I think I told you once before, is one that you have to watch for in people that are depressed. People are very depressed. Yeah? The defense of turning aggression against the self in a depressed person is not good, because that increases the risk of suicide tremendously. And as you remember, I told you, if you have one such patient with one such tendency, you look as well at his self-esteem before the depressive episode. In other words, what kind of self-esteem did they have before they became depressed, and when they were healthy, did they value themselves? Did they have good self-regard? Did they have good self-esteem? If they did, they are better protected than somebody that gets depressed and whose self-esteem has always been very poor because he has nothing to protect. And if on top of that he turns aggression against himself, the chances of suicide get potentiated, tremendously. So you watch that very closely, particularly in suicidal people. If I have any patient that is depressed, whatever type of depression he has, I will always combat for feelings of self-regard before the incident, how they regulate the self-esteem, how good that was. Because typically, in many patients, that was good before. It becomes a mess when they become depressed because that's part of the depression. But if before that, they had good self-esteem, then the chances of these people committing suicide diminish some. It's not that they are free of risk, but they are at less risk as somebody who values the self not at all from immemorial times, and that on top of that has a tendency to turn aggression against the self, because that's a very explosive combination. Now, just as you can use that defense to enrich your thinking about certain type of patients clinically and take care of them in a certain way, most of these defenses you can do the same with it. You just have to get familiar with them. And as I said, know what they mean, what they cover, what type of conflicts they typically are used against, what type of stage of development. As I told you earlier, these defenses are not there all from the beginning. They appear in a sequence. You remember we talked about that a little while back. And that sequence is related to the cognitive development of children. Obviously, you cannot use intellectualization at 2 years of age or rationalization. You need a good, well-developed ego capacity to be able to do this. So it takes some time for you to be able to do that. And so all of these defenses appear in a sequence. The ones that appear earlier tend to be very primitive. And these were the ones of introjection and projection and internalization and things of that kind. And as you grow older, then the ego has better ways of dealing with things. So, by the type of defense, you usually can say this is a very primitive conflict and came from a long way back in development, or it is not such a primitive conflict. It's related to this, that, or the other, and came from much later in development. And so you are constantly, it's like an archaeologist. You find your little, charts, and you say, oh yeah, I know what this belongs to, what culture this was, and possibly at what time it happened, and all of that. So this is the same, yeah. That's the main group.
Is there a particular relation between bipolar disorder and turning aggression on the self?
Not necessarily, no. Not all bipolar disorders turn aggression against the self. Some turn them to the objects real fast and efficiently. They can be very dangerous. Usually, when bipolar disorders get hurt, they get hurt by the lack of judgment, by the feelings of omnipotence and grandiosity and so on. It's only when they are in the depressive state that these things then become an issue, But the bipolar person in the manic state feels on top of the world. He's God. Nothing can happen to him. He's, and that's why they don't come. They don't like to come down from that place because it feels so good. They do, but sometimes it takes people years to accept the fact that they better take medication in spite of how good the feeling is, because it ruins their life, and they have to go to the bottom of the barrel sometimes 10, 15, 20 years before they say, look, I have to take medication, this is not viable. Feels very good, but it's very destructive, so that's the problem.
So there's no close association between that disorder and that defense mechanism like there is between OCD and isolation
No.
affective?
No, no, no. Okay. Remember, these defenses, and this is another important concept, these defenses are particularly useful in the conceptualization of disorders where the symptom formation is based on the existence of psychological forces in conflict. In other words, these defenses are applicable. We all use them. It's what the ego does to deal with defenses. But generally speaking, these apply to neurotic type of conflicts. When you have a schizophrenic patient or a bipolar disorder, and so that's a genetic disorder, it disarrays the brain in a different way, and these defenses may be visible because they still have content, they still think about something, and some of these defenses may be there, but they don't have the same meaning anymore because you have a brain that is in disarray where these things don't apply anymore, you know. You have to keep them apart. The major psychiatric disorder are something somewhat different, where this is not as applicable. It doesn't mean to say that if you are depressed or bipolar or schizophrenic, that the content of your delusions is not related to your developmental history and your conflicts, but your ego is not capable of using these defenses as it does in a neurotic patient. Your ego is completely out of whack, and so you can use it in the same way, yeah? Though it helps you to understand much of the content of the delusions and the hallucinations and so on.
We had talked, you and I, about a week ago about, I think it was projection and displacement and the differences between those.
Projection?
Yeah.
No, it's totally different.
You said you had described the difference between, there were three of them. I was trying to remember what they were. Projection, displacement, and one more.
Internalization, maybe.
Maybe. Or was it internalization and
Or
introjection?
externalization, maybe. I don't know. These are closely related. Which one are you having problems with?
For me, I think it was projection and displacement.
Well, displacement is very simple. It really means that the object that is the subject of your impulses, whatever they may be, and is usually aggressive ones that will get you in trouble with your parents or society or whatever, you displace
Someone else.
to someone else. So instead of kicking your brother in the head, you kick the dog. That's not too good, but it's not as bad as kicking. It won't produce the same response in your parents. It still will produce a response, but it may not be as dramatic. Yeah? So that's displacement. Animals do that all the time. You know, they display a lot of aggression, but then they go and back and, you know, peck at the tree rather than peck at the head of another turkey or whatever it may be. Externalization and projection
That's what.
is something that is in you, is not acceptable to you, and you throw it out, you externalize it. So it's out there, it's no longer you. Some things you can only externalize to another human object. For example, if it is a bisexual conflict and you are not sure whether you are homosexual or you have a clear heterosexual identity and you are conflicted about it, the homosexual aspect of it, you may throw it out, but you can throw it to the door. The door is not something that you can attribute that type of interest or behavior to, so you choose another human being and you say, I'm not, but he probably is. That's externalization. As long as it stays there, it's externalization. But externalization has a bad habit of the boomerang. You throw it out and it hits something over there, but then comes back to you. And the way it comes back to you, that you put over there becomes a threat to you again. You say, I'm not, but he thinks I am, I'm going to kill him if he makes a pass at me. You see what I mean? It's a very malignant type of defense, because you lost reality testing. You no longer know that this is you. 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 You no longer You're not testing reality. You don't know inside from outside. You throw it out there, and now you believe that that is true. So you're being in that space of your mind, you are psychotic. Your reality testing is completely gone.
So what's the difference between that and projection?
Between what and projection?
Internalization.
Externalization and projection.
Externalization stays out there.
Mhm.
Doesn't come back to you. It only becomes projection when the danger that you externalize is coming back to you as a threat.
Okay.
You understand the difference? Do you understand the difference?
I think so. It's not projection until it comes full circle.
That's correct. It's like a boomerang. It's no projection until it's come back to your hand. Yeah.
The defense projective identification,
Yeah.
that's when you project something unwanted to another person, and then you identify with that as a way to take it back. But I
Well-
don't understand that. It's too
I avoid them like the plague. Projective identification I avoid. That's why I don't mention it. Because there are people that describe it in many different ways. What you describe is one way of describing it. And in a way, it does happen. But it's very difficult to describe and dissect. And there are, what people mean by projective identification is very complex. But you describe it well. It's something that is in you, you put it out there, and then you take it back, but you say, this wasn't mine, I took it from him. Or from her.
So it's a way of having
So it's
both
not
ways.
mine, it's his fault. If it is bad, it's not me that is bad. I learned it from him.
But you look, okay.
Alright? But it's
attached to the identification of the other.
Yeah.
You decide.
Yeah.
But other people use it in a completely different manner, and it becomes very, very confusing.
Can you say what you just said? That's the best I ever heard described. That's
Yeah.
that idea. Can you say it one more time?
What you do is there is something in you that is not acceptable to you. So you put it in somebody else, and then you take it back. But now you are saying, it's not mine, I took it from there. So if this is bad, it's her fault, not mine. You understand what I mean?
Right.
It's,
Because people can do that about anger or whatever. Like I wasn't the one. Like maybe they were originally angry at you, but they kind of projected onto you. Then they kind of
whatever it is, you see, maybe something that your superego finds unacceptable.
Well, maybe then you'll say, oh, I understand why that person is angry. I'm angry too for them. So it's a way of expressing the
You
anger, but not owning
yeah,
it.
you could say that, and indeed these people will say that.
Yeah.
It will say, yeah, I understand it. But in fact, they took it from him.
Right.
Of course they understand it. It was their own, they throw it out, took it back, and so they have owned it twice. Only that they are owning it and disowning it at the same time. You see what I mean?
And Indian givers.
Yeah, because then you can say to your superego, but don't blame me. Came from there, fellow. You know?
Doesn't,
Which is, it doesn't work too well, I can tell you that.
A lot of rationalization.
How much time do we have now?
we have about 9 more minutes.
All right, tell me a minute or two before it's going to be finished, yeah.
I've heard different opinions of splitting, and I guess the way that I've generally heard it is that it's an ability to see the complexity of a person or of an object, and that you split like the good side from the bad side. But in the definition, you were using it in a different way.
No. This is splitting of the ego.
Okay.
There are many other forms of splitting. We are not referring to that.
Not of the object.
No, it's not a splitting of the object. You can split objects into good and bad objects and so on, and good and bad, but that's whatever you want to think about.
I understand about a really severe splitting of the ego, like in dissociative disorders. Can you give an example of a milder splitting? You know,
Historical splittings? Yeah. I get one here the other night. It's a complex one, and maybe we will end there. There is a little more that I wanted to tell you about the fences. But I give you an example. Many years ago, You may, some of you that came to the adoption thing heard this already. Was in a patient who had a number of psychosomatic symptoms. You know, hypochondriacal, in fact, hysterical conversions is essentially what it was. It was a young woman married to a young man, very loving young couple, they were very attached to each other. And they came to me with this large number of somatic complaints, conversion symptoms. And they used to live in a very remote part of the country, had no access to anybody. So I thought, well, in those days, one used to use hypnosis for this type of cases. Because what you try to do is substitute the symptoms. You could take with suggestion the symptoms away, depending on the case. But if you did that, shortly thereafter was a produce of the symptoms. So you learn not to do that. What you learn to do is, I'm going to take this symptom, which is very handicapping, and put another one that is more tolerable and those with damage. So you took the bigger damage and made it a little less damaging. When I got this woman, I said, well, I told the husband, I'm going to work with her in hypnosis to see if I can get to these hysterical conversions and substitute this symptom for something more benign. I said, fine. He didn't understand a word I was saying, but he said, fine. So I took her into my office, that was my private office, put her in a couch, and proceeded to hypnotize her. It took a few minutes to hypnotize her. She was a wonderful hypnotic subject in no time at all. She was in a deep trance. So I started my business. And suddenly, she started to talk like a Chinese male, which was common in my country. There were a lot of Chinese people that had little stores in corner where they sold ice cream and vegetables and things like that. And I said, what the heck is this? I wasn't expecting that. I haven't heard anything about this woman being able to dissociate or anything like that. That's not what you came for. So there was a Chinese man. You had to deal with the Chinese man. I said, well, who are you? What are you doing here? And he told me who he was. He said he was. He had known this woman since she was a little girl. This is all with a male voice and a Chinese accent, which I could imitate, but she really sounded like a typical Chinese male speaking Spanish. So I said, well, what are you doing here? He said, well, you know, she wants to get pregnant. I said, well, and he said, well, you know, her husband can make her pregnant. She needs help. It's important for her to be pregnant. It's the most important thing in her life. And I want you to help her. Well, that sounded very fishy to me. So I said, well, what do you want me to help her? I said, well, could you not make her pregnant? I said, no, I can't do that. And at that point, that woman jumped on me. I was sitting, you know, she was lying in that couch. I was sitting over here. She jumped on me, knocked me out of the chair, and there I was. She was stronger, you wouldn't believe it. It was a little woman, but it became very strong all of a sudden. In Cuba, you used to wear short white coats in your office instead of the long ones that we use here. Too hot there, so it's not hotter than here, but people use short. She covered me in lipstick and, you know, rush and whatnot. My secretary was by the door, wondering what happened, as, you know, crying, worried, you know, not crying, but shouting, what's wrong, what's wrong? Open the door, open the door. So after a while, I sat on the woman, which is the best I could do. And then I took her out of the trance and sat here. She was completely indifferent to all of this. She sat there, and I was thinking to myself, as I told people here yesterday or the other day, how the heck I'm going to tell this man? How will I explain this? You know? So I said, well, I told the secretary, call him. The secretary has eyes that big. And I said, call the husband. And I brought him in. and told him, you know, and this is going to be difficult to explain, but this is what happened. While I had her in the couch, she became a Chinese man, jumped on me, and I had a hell of a time dealing with her. I said, oh, the Chinese man, you saw the Chinese man too? I said, yeah. You know the Chinese man? He said, oh, yeah. He comes frequently in the evening, about midnight, wakes me up and threatens me that will kill me. And he said, occasionally, there is a knife that she has on her hand. When she dissociated like this and is threatening to kill me, I said, are you not frightened of the possibility that in that state she will say, no, you didn't want to do me anyhow. So I was as puzzled as you look. I said, how the hell did it happen? So I asked him, what is this? The Chinese man said you want to get pregnant with this and what? Oh yeah, she, you know, this is the problem. And she had been having problems since that time. The problem is that she wants children. And we went to a gynecologist and were very well, you know, kind of examined and so on. The gynecologist told me she can have children. She will never have a child from her. But he knew that it was so important to her that he said, don't tell her that, please. Tell her that I am sterile, that it is my fault. And he did. The gynecologist said, fine. Told her, it's your husband's fault. So I told him, well, I wish you had told me that beforehand. And he said, well, I didn't think it was important, you know, that's something that happened a long time ago. So I told him, well, we had to tell her. Otherwise, this Chinese man is going to disappear and things may become worse. And I'm not so sure that one day she might not try to hurt you, you know, in this dissociated state, because people that dissociate sometimes murder people. So he was convinced that she wouldn't, and I was inclined to believe that this woman loved that man dearly, and that was a conflict. Otherwise she would have run somewhere and found, it's not difficult to find somebody to make you pregnant, is it? But obviously she couldn't do that. She was as well a religious woman and really loved her husband. This was a very good working class couple, not very cultured but very attached to one another. So he said, well, okay, well, I don't tell her. I said, no, here. We put her in a hospital and I will tell her then, but I will take a few days because she's going to become very depressed and possibly suicidal. And so we took her to Valdez Castillo. You remember Valdez Castillo? Probably didn't exist anymore in Havana. This was a famous sanatorium. They had the name of a psychiatrist which founded it. And I had her there for several days. Little bit by little bit, we talk about this problem of the pregnancy. She obviously has some inkling that she had problems, you know. And so I finally told her she got very depressed, suicidal, so she was under 24 hours precautions of somebody with her and all that. And I was going to see her a couple of times a day, and I said, well, there are solutions to this. What is the problem? You can adopt a child. She wanted a girl. I said, you can adopt a little girl. Well, that idea took on her. And after a few days, I said, can you help me adopt a little girl? I said, yeah, I can put you in touch with people that you can adopt children from. And that was the answer to the problem. They adopted a child and followed them for several years. The Chinese man never came back, and she was very happy. That's not a malignant dissociation. See, that's a hysterical dissociation. In a woman that, though primitive and very badly wanting a child, still had morals, was religious, and loved her husband, and that was enormously conflictual to her. Otherwise, she would have gone anywhere, and it's not difficult to find somebody that will make you that kind of favor. You know, so but that's very different from some malignant dissociative phenomena. Some of them are very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. Indeed, they are sadistic murderers.
Why did she pick a Chinese man role? Is there any logic to that?
Apparently there was a Chinese man in the corner of her house.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I only saw her this
Yeah.
time, never saw her again, except occasionally, once every so many years actually. And occasionally got a Christmas card, or we're doing well, I forget the name of the little girl, but let's say that she was called Joyce. Joyce is doing beautifully, you should see her, she's going to school, whatever, So, Mike?
I actually misread it. You have 8 more minutes.
8 more
Or
minutes.
actually make it 7.
Okay, well, let me tell you then this, because next time we want to talk a little bit about affects, affective states and responses, though, as you would have read in this profile, that was an experimental section, and we were not doing much out with it, we were trying to get the information. And as you will see, the information is significant and helpful, but still we didn't have the same knowledge about this that we have about other parts of this diagnostic evaluation. What you have to do now with these defenses is, you have to notice the secondary interference of defense activity with zero achievements. You remember I told you all defenses have a price. They solve a problem, but all defenses, or most defenses, have a cost. And the cost is usually in terms of energy. We have so much energy. And if we put it into the defensive activity of the ego, especially certain type of defenses, as you remember I told you, repression, which is an anticathexis, that takes a lot of your resources and attach them to that conflict, and you lost it. So you cannot use that energy for neutralized activities like going to school and learning or doing your job or whatnot. All this, as you remember, sublimation, reaction formation, has an initial cost, but then it pays enormous dividends to you. So these are very good defenses. So what they are asking you is look at all of these defenses that you see in the patient, and you won't see the 34 of them. Patients tend to use 4, 5, 6 of them. The more they use, the more deterred they are. If defenses are effective and of good quality, usually patients don't use a large array of defenses. The more you see, it means that the ego is thinking and saying, send more reinforcement, send from there, send from here, send from anywhere else, And then you see nothing is working, but then you see a lot of defense activity. Here what they are trying to tell you is take a look at all of that and try and make some judgment between the interferences that are due to quantitative factors, such as excessive expenditure of energy in contact cathexis, like in repression, or qualitative factors, such as use of projection, that interferes with reality testing and damage your ego in that sense. It really makes you psychotic in a certain area of the personality. Or withdrawal into fantasy, for example, that will interfere with your concentration. If you are a child in school, you will not learn. At work, you will become inefficient. You may be fired, things of the kind, You are a student, you may not be able to study and pass your exams and things of that kind. Now that's the damage that it does. Then you look at the gains that the defense use have produced, so you are making some judgment of what gains were made by using the type of defensive structure that the patient has, and that might be significant. Other times you say the gain is none, it's all a loss, It's like a bad balanced budget. So you then look at the balance between the secondary interference, the illness as a whole, and these gains, and you examine them together. And such considerations are frequently a significant factor in estimating the advisability and possible response to treatment, and what kind of treatment you are going to use. Obviously, if you have people with very primitive and large number of defenses. You have a very disturbed person, maybe a borderline narcissistic character disorder or something akin to a psychotic kind of disorganization, and you're not going to recommend that they go into analysis. That'd be crazy. So it gives you some idea as to what you need to do and how you should handle that situation. Sometimes, with some type of patient, the decision that you make is don't touch it. That's the best they can do. And we sometimes, therapists, have the idea that we can do better than the patient did. And that's frequently not true. A good dosage of modesty is something that we all have to learn, and we are not willing to learn, and we are going to be taught the hard way, because you're going to put your foot in your mouth once in a while. And what that means is you have to have a great deal of respect for what the patient could do by himself. You always have to say, that's the best this patient could do at that time in his circumstances, given his resources, his genetic giving, his environment, and his developmental vicissitudes. Can you do better? Can you change that? Has he got resources that are there but got damaged or are being blocked, by the defense use of the conflicts that he is suffering from? And can you really leave these forces and have them move forward? Can you change some of the maladaptive solutions that the patient found, which sometimes you can, because they were done when he was little, had little resources, may not have too much of ego development, may have been too frightened, may have been too brutal, a father or a mother or whatever. And now situations are different. He had, on the other hand, grown a lot since. And so you are trying to see, can I really help him to produce a better, more adaptive solution with the resources that I see he has, than the one he has produced. And sometimes you can do that, and sometimes you cannot. And there are patients that you'll be wise to leave well alone. What you do is you are supportive, you see them, you pat them on the shoulder if you need to, you give them advice, you do whatever you can, but you don't mess up with the arrangement that they have, because you may not only not make it better, you may make it worse. So you have to be very careful. Yeah? That's it. So you have to check these things very carefully, and this helps you. This helps you. The defense structure of the patient will tell you a lot about the ego strengths and resources of this patient and what is hidden behind all of